Hello and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. This is the Ukraine War Update Extra video, giving you extra tidbits and nuggets to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. Let's go to something I've been meaning to for the last couple of days, which is have a little look at this video I mentioned the other day, Euromaidan press video. Only a few hundred views on this, but it's well worth looking at to get an insight into the experiences of people on the front line. Here are a couple of people from fighting in Bakhmut and one from Vuhledar, who they are all injured, recovering in hospital, and they're giving their own sort of accounts of what's going on here. I will just talk you through what this guy says. I'll try and nip you through the first bit of what he says by reading out the subtitles to you. So the question is, what do you think about the continuation of the war? And he says, everyone waits for our offensive. There is a lack of weapons, tanks. At least we haven't seen it yet. So we haven't seen those big piece of equipment. Everyone wants this. Everyone wants an end to the war. We only need more weapons to attack. We need more heavy equipment. Lots of wounded. Not everyone was evacuated in time and died. If there was heavy equipment, it would be easier to take them out. Did the artillery shelling or something else injure you? Is a question to this guy from Vuhledar. 82mm mortar. Yes, mortars are needed and ammunition for them is required, says the original guy. Russian fire and fire from mortars constantly. He says, we don't have this. He says they fire constantly from morning till night. We don't have this. So this was his experience in Bakhmut. Even when they are attacking, if you ask for ammunition, you don't always receive it because everything is limited. I acquired a PKM machine gun in a fight and it's working well. It's good that it's got lots of ammunition to suit it. Even the Maxim gun, the 7.62mm Maxim gun, it's a miracle that I stood in Bakhmut for 16 days. Many guys, well, I'm very emotional now, he says. So obviously, he's recovering, but many of his friends didn't survive. When I killed them, Russians, I don't feel any compassion at all. But I'm a normal civilian human. They are under the influence of some drugs, definitely. It's impossible to crawl among corpses like that and still crawl further. I don't understand how it's possible. They throw their soldiers just to the slaughter. What I saw, I even have some photos on a phone. It's like animals crawling. I heard the commander shouting, attack, to attack. Although they were scared, they yelled at us to surrender when fighting on the streets. They are compelled to crawl, and they crawl day and night constantly toward us. It is the most terrible at night. Even if you have a thermal imager, you don't see it like in the day. They reach windows, having grenades already with safety clips taken out. They like the most to steal up and throw grenades through windows. I want the war to end, honestly. Everyone's tired. Give us weapons and we'll end it ASAP. It's a fact. So that was his account of his experiences in Bakhmut. The others say similar sorts of things. They talk about, what's your idea of ending this? Well, back to the territory in 1991, and they're pretty clear on that. Now, I thought it was interesting about the kind of dehumanization of the enemy soldiers. When I kill them, I don't feel any compassion at all. And this is a really interesting idea. It would be really psychologically difficult to kill people that you really emotionally felt for and empathized with. So in order to become a soldier and in order to carry out your function as a soldier, which is killing the enemy, then you have to in some way dehumanize them. Now, when we go back to talk about propagandists doing this and you dehumanizing a whole population, and that allows public backing for politicians who have equally dehumanized their whole population, that leads to genocide. And that kind of dehumanization is terrible. All dehumanization is terrible and wrong in and of itself. but but when it's the mechanism that you have to use in order to kill people who are aggressively invading your country, then it's understandable that that kind of dehumanization takes place, and it's justifiable. If you didn't have that, you literally wouldn't be able to defend you wouldn't be able to kill the enemy, which means you wouldn't be able to effectively defend your population, your country, and the aggressor would always win. Defenders would, So uh, I find this interesting. Andy S89 the other day asked, "Hi John, is it morally right for Ukrainians to celebrate the death of Russian invaders?" This is a kind of similar question. I thought it would jive quite well with that idea. Or to say it's a good day in regards to the death reports. And is it right for supporters of Ukraine to think or say this? I'd love to hear your thoughts. This is a really interesting point. So what we do is what I do when I'm talking about the death statistics is I'm not dehumanizing the soldiers or the people fighting this war. I'm kind of like humanizing them. I'm like, this is just, I'm not making them less than, I'm just not even thinking of their humanity. So these are just numbers on a sheet, and that sounds horrible. But if you're going to analyze what is going on, statistically, then unfortunately that's what has to happen, or is what does happen, because otherwise everything just becomes mired in emotion and psychology, and you're unable to actually do the job, in my case, the job of analyzing what's going on the battlefield in a kind of objective sort of way. But that's a really, really great question. I love questions like this. Is it morally right for Ukrainians to celebrate the death of Russian invaders? This is a really involved philosophical question, because there's so much going on there. On the one hand, you are celebrating the death of human beings, which is terrible. If you've just seen them as human beings, as the whole of their lives, a culmination of their life up to that point, and that's being extinguished, and you go, "Yay, that's great," then that sounds really weird. But if you're like seeing these people as invaders who are doing that to your population, who are impinging on your rights, if they are killing your friends and family and neighbors, and committing war crimes X, Y, and Z, and I'm not saying all of those people are doing those things, but they're all part of that, then stopping that from happening by necessarily having to kill those invaders gives you a sense of we are succeeding in doing what we need to do to merely exist and survive as either a nation or a community or a family or an individual. Then you can see that would give some kind of pleasure, but that pleasure is almost not seeing them as human beings and people. But then on the other hand, going back to this idea of the soldiers, you are seeing them as people, as humans, because you're literally shooting them and seeing them as that. But again, you are actually somehow, you're having to, whether these people are evil or not, that's how you're having to see them. You are seeing these as evil aggressors, irrespective of whether they're convicts that are trying to do this to free their lives, or whether they've been forced mobilized, or whether they, whatever their actual situation is, whether it's reality or not, you have to make them. And I don't know, I'm doing a lot of speculation here. I've not fought on a front line, obviously, but I assume you would have to be tarring them all with a kind of evil brush. You are all, I can't, it's too difficult for me to comprehend and empathize with who you are as actual people. I can't do that because I wouldn't be able to pull the trigger. So you are all therefore evil. You're all, less than or whatever, and that allows me to do my job of being a soldier. How we deal with those as they get translated into statistics, what we're doing is we are thinking of the big picture, which is the oppressed nation being invaded by an aggressor. That political situation is morally bad. Like the aggressors, Russia and Putin, are morally abhorrent here, and they're doing terrible things. And so when the Ukrainians are winning, this is moving towards a moral conclusion that we think is absolutely good and right, and therefore any information that feeds into that eventuality is going to be met with kind of some kind of pleasure. But in order to think of it in those terms, you have to kind of not think about the fact that we are dealing with hundreds and hundreds of human lives on a daily basis being extinguished. And yeah, there's so much more to say about that. I mean, that's like a 2-hour conversation. And you could even go into things about whether libertarian free will exists and whether these humans are just fulfilling where they are in that point in life, and then it all gets rather complicated. And then when you're, giving joy about what they're doing, is that good or right? But then can you help what you're doing, etc., etc.? These are like what are sometimes called reactive attitudes, and it's really difficult to overcome psychologically reactive attitudes. Anyway, I'm liable to go off on a really big piece of tangent there, so I won't. Right, let's move on to something else. But thank you, really good comment. A Ukrainian 2S1 Grozdika 122 mil self-propelled howitzer was destroyed by Russian Lancet loitering munition. Another 2S1 and another launcher and a S300, really valuable piece of kit, surface-to-air missile system, and a Crab 155 were also hit, but the aftermath is not completely conclusive. So with these Lancets, now the point of me showing you this video is to hammer home the issue, the threat that Lancers are to. These are loitering munitions, kamikaze drones, whatever you want to call them. The threat that they are still posing to the Ukrainians and to the Ukrainian material. These do have, checkered is the wrong word, like there's a variable outcome to these hitting, and sometimes the video will cut away. You don't really know actually the damage they cause. Sometimes they do just sort of bounce off what they hit. Some people have been claiming that the S300 here wasn't really hit. There's no secondary explosion. You can make your own mind up. This is undoubtedly going to come with some music, so let's turn that off. So the Lancers are definitely an issue. What I'd like to know is how many of these kind of take place a day. I mean, that's a catastrophic hit there or explosion. That's the S300, and as you can see, it doesn't really seem to that the flame there seems to be from the detonation itself, from the munition, as opposed to from the vehicle. And if you're Ukrainian, that's the sort of vehicle you'd want to be fixing, for sure. And then I think that's a Crab that gets pretty much taken out. But yeah, the Lancers are a threat. We're starting to see a lot more first-person view drones that the Ukrainians are using. And this apparently is causing quite a lot of consternation amongst the Russians. I'll see if I can dig something out about that. Yes, here it is. It's a ABC Australian news piece on kamikaze drones, first-person view drones particularly. Why Ukraine's kamikaze racing drones are causing a buzz on and off the battlefield. It's talking about how they've really sort of gained momentum over the course of the war, how you've seen an evolution of drone usage throughout the war. These are cheaper, immersive, and precise, costing less than $1,000. Ukrainians aren't worried about getting them back. The popular US-made Switchblade drone traditionally costs around $12,000, while the DJI Mavic, which is commonly used as a loitering munition carrier, runs at just over $2,000. So yeah, you can get military constructed kamikaze drones that cost a lot more money, and lots of reasons for that. Or you can just get commercial off-the-shelf drones and then adapt them by, as you can see here, adding an RPG-7 warhead or RPG warhead. So on and so forth. When you are seeing these FPV drones, it's kind of an evolution in terms of ability, speed, capability, and price, which is a really important factor. These are more a specialist Ferrari type drone designed to be fast and maneuverable. Their range is limited to about 5 to 10 kilometers, but a defining capability is how they are controlled. Pilots strap on goggles with a live streamed camera feed from the drones, giving them a unique immersive view. This allows pilots to be more accurate and to carry out surprise attacks in enclosed spaces or to loiter and wait for a target. So various videos have been released appearing to show the dramatic use of these drones. I've shown you a number of these. Discussions have been ramping up on Russian Telegram channels about the impact of FPV drones. So I've talked about the impact of the Lancet drones for the Russians on the Ukrainians and how much of a thorn in the side of the Ukrainians these are. Well, I think FPV drones have been the Ukrainian answer to that, and they are causing consternation amongst the Russians, according to military weapons expert Samuel Bendet. Russian military commentators have noted how quickly they moved to the foreground when 6 months ago attention was on commercial DJI quadcopters. So your quadcopters with the four rotor blades on top and often looking down rather than more powerful ones that move forward and the view is forward. They added that FPVs cost considerably less than the Russia's Lancet loitering munition drones. For months, Russia has been carrying out its own kamikaze-style attacks using Iranian-made Shahed 136 drones, which are packed with explosives and hitting key Ukrainian infrastructure. While they're much larger and more powerful than Ukraine's FPV drones, they are also considerably more expensive and supply is difficult. Countries such as Australia, the US and Canada have placed a series of sanctions on suppliers to Iran of the Iranian drones to Russia. It continues later, quoting someone, these quadcopters can be reconnaissance or even retrofitted for lethal strikes, but they're more commercially available and impossible to embargo, she told the APC. There's a constant flow of these sorts of drones, your commercial drones from China through to Russia. Rumored stockpiles here. So Ukraine has been pushing to build its army of drones, pledging to spend $550 million on UAVs, on drones in 2023, with a focus on local supply deals. And I talked to you about that. I talked to you about how United 24 has been funding that, and they've got $310 million worth of funding for that has been raised. In January, the government launched a campaign to raise additional funds for a fleet of 1,000 FPV drones, describing them as a revolutionary combat tool. That money is being raised through the Star Life Charity Foundation, which has helped Ukrainian forces since the start of Russia's invasion, and also other key organizations independently crowdfunding and developing the kamikaze drones, and that is, of course, United 24 and others. And it's about getting these up to scale so that eventually these are just a phenomenally prevalent menace to the Russian lines. A pro-Russian blogger last week posted claims that Ukraine has already bought up to almost the entire market of FPV drone components in China. He said more than 50,000 drones have stockpiled for a series of swarm attacks, and the post has been viewed more than 2 million times and attracted hundreds of comments. Last month, an unverified video also did the rounds on social media, apparently showing a stockpile of hundreds of the racing drones for Ukraine. So, here you have a number of these drones, and if you think that each one of those drones can have attached to it an RPG warhead, then you are talking a phenomenal amount of damage that can be done to Russian forces. And it's just about getting these to the front line and getting trained operators working these to their maximum potential. But I mean, just look at that. That's just one room with a whole bunch of these bad boys waiting to go. Incredible. It's likely that Ukraine is accessing large quantities of the parts and developing the drones quickly, Mr. Cave said, who seems to be some kind of expert. I saw a statistic somewhere. If you look at the civilian industry, there's something like 100,000 being manufactured a month globally, he said. The fact that these are really, really inexpensive items, and as the Ukrainians get better and better at manufacturing them, they will be able to scale up. He said limitations laid with the number of pilots who can be trained to launch swarm attacks. I don't know whether swarm attacks is the right word here. I've seen swarm being used particularly if the swarm is autonomous itself. So the swarm works on its own and integrating each entity, integrating and communicating with the other to do whatever they're doing, rather than a massive individually operated drones. Now, you might call that swarm, but I think the jargon is technically that wouldn't be a swarm, but I may be wrong on that. you're not going to have 1,000 Ukrainian drone operators, but they might have quite a few hundred. So you couldn't necessarily have 1,000 drone flyover, but what you could do is have 10 to 20 that go in wave after wave after wave until you've completely destroyed the target. Can they be stopped? Anti-drone technology has been a holy grail since the beginning of the war, and Trentelenko's talked about this. Mick Ryan, the Australian retired general, has talked about this. It's all about it's the arms race. So once you produce an arm, it's about what's the thing that's either bigger and better than that, or the thing that can deal with that. And then it's okay, how do you evolve that original thing to be able to evade being dealt with? Okay, then how do you react to that? And you have this consistent arms race that goes on. So the pressure is on both armies to find ways of negating the use of these drones, taking them down in electronic warfare, so on and so forth. Most drone systems can be jammed, so both sides are continuously experimenting with different types of jamming technologies. In addition to developing its own anti-jamming systems, Professor Krebs said the US and Israel in particular have been developing and sending anti-drone technologies to Ukraine. Interesting that Israel's involved in that. Russian media last week reported the country's new SERP VS5 anti-drone system has passed tests and was ready for deployment. It has a capability to jam signals and detect intruder drones across a span of 360 degrees within a 5-kilometer range, according to the state news agency TASS, so on and so forth. But you hear lots of accounts of drones getting taken down, of just falling out of the sky. So electronic warfare does happen, but it's about making it consistently efficient to bring down what looks like hundreds and hundreds of drones possibly being used in a single area. Going forward to see how this kind of technology will evolve and be deployed. When it comes to defending against swarms of kamikaze drone strikes, it's all a game of numbers. As Ukraine has learned with Russia's kamikaze drone onslaughts, you can down 85%, but it only takes a handful to get through to cause significant damage. The speed and size of FPV drones makes them even trickier to target when launched en masse. So the thing about the Shahed 131 and 136 drones is that they aren't particularly quick. They're quite slow, they're quite loud, you can detect them quite easily, whereas these FPV drones are a lot more maneuverable. With the FPVs, the Ukrainians might be launching in numbers if there's a spring counteroffensive. They're moving at a much faster pace, are more agile, they're smaller, and they're able to loiter and change direction. So the Russian military commentators on Telegram highlighted that the swarm potential of the kamikaze drones made it quite obvious about the future, that the future belongs to robotic unmanned technologies, predicting it may be possible within 10 to 15 years. So yeah, this is really where this war is going. But I think wars in general, this is going to be one of the many things that we learn from this war. Will concern autonomous weaponry and technologies. Right, let's go to a Chris O thread. This is one, I think he's done 3 of these so far. We just do the first part today. This is conquering Crimea. It'll be a bit of history. So since 2014, Crimea has been under Russian control. Ukraine naturally wants it back, but what does history show about the challenges of reconquering it? In a series of threads, I'll look at the lessons of past wars. So a little bit of history involved in this thread, so something a bit different. Crimea's fascinating military history has been of interest to me for many years. I travelled there in the early 2000s to study its old battlefields, so some of this will be drawn from personal recollections and notes. Let's review Crimea's physical geography. It's a rough diamond-shaped peninsula, about 320 kilometers east to west by about 200 kilometers north to south. It's mostly flat, apart from the Crimean mountains in the far north, which are up to 1,500 meters, so 5,000 feet high. Crimea borders the Black Sea on its west and south sides, and the Sea of Azov in the east. It's separated from Russia by narrow Kerch Strait, across which Russia has built Europe's longest road and railway bridge to link it to the Russian mainland. Right, the peninsula's climate is almost subtropical in the far south, but in the north and centre it's mostly arid. As the 2018 vegetation map highlights, agriculture is dependent on the irrigation canal that runs from the Dnipro River in the Kherson region. I've talked plenty about that. Comes down here, and this was cut off in 2014, and caused all sorts of trouble agriculturally, but also in terms of general water supplies. There were droughts, effectively rationing, dirty water, all sorts of problems over the last 8 years in Crimea, and that was why that was one of the Novikhovka Dam was one of the first targets for Russia as they invaded from Crimea. Crimea is separated from the Ukrainian mainland by the Sivash, an area of salt lagoons and marshes which connects to the Sea of Azov via a narrow strait. It's also known as a putrid or rotten sea for its pungent smell in the summer. This image shows its natural colours. The Sivash covers around 2,500 square kilometers, 965 square miles, and is up to 35 kilometers wide, but is very shallow, only about 3 meters deep at maximum, so 10 feet deep at maximum. In some places and in the right times, it can be forded on foot. This is militarily significant, as we will see. So, talking about all these kind of areas up here, if it's quite shallow and can be forded quite easily, then actually it's not just about these two single areas of entry to Ukraine. There are only 3 narrow places along the entire 100-kilometer, 62-mile long northern flank of Crimea where the peninsula is connected to the Ukrainian mainland. This is why Crimea has often been called a natural fortress and makes it a difficult place to invade. From east to west, these places are the Arabat Spit, the Chonhar Peninsula, and the Perekop Isthmus. I don't know which one of those two are. All 3 of these have been used to invade Crimea, as we'll see in later threads in the series. For completeness, we should mention that the Kerch Strait as an entry point, as that's also of military importance. It's only 3.1 kilometers wide at its narrowest. As well as a bridge, it's also crossed by ferries from Port Crimea to the Chuska Spit on the Russian side. So you've got the bridge there, but you've also got ferries. And when the bridge was hit and taken down, it was the ferries that were operating. Oh no, I think the ferries. Actually, I don't know. It looks like because my Russian isn't quite as good as it should be. Crossed by ferries from Port Crimea. I think that could be Port Crimea. So I think the ferries might go across there, and the bridge actually stretches across a longer route there, but I could be wrong there. Okay, so if we go to the next one, so the Arabat Spit is 112 kilometers long, is a long sand spit, the longest in the world, which is only 270 meters wide at its narrowest point. It's low and exposed, relies on 2 bridges to connect it to the Ukrainian mainland, and only connects to Crimea at its far southern end. Okay, so that's a spit that goes all the way up there, and it appears to be connected to the mainland by a couple of bridges in places. Okay, so there's no proper road along the spit, only a sandy track, although Russia has suggested that it might create a new road to improve Crimea's connection to the Ukrainian mainland. Currently, though, it would be difficult for an army to pass along it. The Chonhar Peninsula is a narrow wedge of land extending south from the Ukrainian mainland into the Sivash, 20 kilometers west of the Arabat Spit. 2 road bridges and 1 railway bridge at its tip carry transport routes from Melitopol in Ukraine across the Sivash. Goodness me, that's difficult to work out that image. The Perekop Isthmus is the only unbridged link between Crimea and the Ukrainian mainland. It's only 9 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, and it's of vital military and economic importance. The road, railway line, and canal from Kherson to Crimea all come through here. So this is one near Armyansk, which goes on to Kherson. There are a few small towns on the isthmus. Perekop, pictured below, is itself technically the oldest. The town has existed there since ancient Greek times. Armyansk was founded by Armenian merchants to trade with the Tatars, who formerly ruled Crimea. To the south, Krasnoperekopsk, literally Red Perekop, is a Soviet town built to house workers at a nearby bromine factory. The village of Ishun, a short way further south, is also of military significance for its location near 3 lakes, Krasna, Kyatske, and Kyryalutska. Where there have been battles on the Chonhar Peninsula and Arabat Spit, the Perekop Isthmus has been recognized for millennia as a gateway to Crimea. A line of fortifications has existed across the isthmus for at least 2,500 years and has repeatedly been fought over. The ancient Greek name for Perekop, Tafros, means dugout place. It likely reflected the presence of a ditch across the isthmus at this point. The ditch is still there, is clearly visible from space, and was fortified further between the 15th and 20th centuries. The fortification, known variously as the Perekop Wall, Turkish Wall, or Tatar Ditch, is up to 45 meters or 150 foot wide and was originally up to 20 meters or 65 foot deep. It was anchored at the Perekop end by the now ruined Orkapi fortress, from which Perekop takes its name. And there you go. The fort was originally built by the Tatar Crimean Khanate in the 15th and 16th centuries to defend Crimea from the Mongol-descended Golden Horde. After the Horde's final defeat, the Tatars launched raids into the north to capture Slavs from the Ottoman slave trade. Not surprisingly, this caused conflict with the Cossacks who lived along the Dnipro. So that's a river to the north west. This brings us to the invasion of Crimea in 1675 by the Cossack Ivan Serko, which will be the subject of my next thread in this series. Okay, so that's a nice bit of introduction as a little bit of info about Crimea. The key points to take away, if we go back to a map there, is the 3 points of entrance. So you've got this Perekop isthmus here, and you've got the Chonha Isthmus there, and then you've got the Arabat Spit that gives you access, as well as obviously the Kerch here, the Kerch Bridge over there. Actually, it looks like no, the Kerch was the smaller Kerch Bridge was the smaller one, I believe. So yeah, I correct myself for about the third time. Loser. Anyway, that is a little bit on Crimea. We'll return in the next extras to part 2 and part 3 of that. I think that would be really useful for understanding this. Hey, every day's a school day, right? And you come along this journey with me. I'm learning as I'm reading these. I hadn't actually read that thread before. That is just me, literally. I knew that would be a good thread to do. So, I'm learning as many of you are learning too. Some of you might already know all this, and hey, just a bit of a reminder. Okay, talking about going back to drones, I should have had this earlier. This is a random one I came across yesterday, which is someone talking about the tornadoes in America that have been hitting America recently. Some guy's been developing drones that reckons he can get these drones into and out of tornadoes and stuff. The point of mentioning that is we talk about how drones won't be able to go up it's too cloudy or too rainy or too snowy or too cold or too this or too that. It's only a matter of time. Technology catches up. There are people working on how to get around all these problems, and soon it will be like Terminator, and there'll be unmanned drones flying around doing wars autonomously, and we'll be cowering in caves because technology's taken over or something. Okay, Michael Kaufman and Franz Stefan Gady here have produced a paper. So Kaufman, I dipped into his podcast he did recently, and he had visited Bakhmut, had quite a lot to say about that. Some of it was like the challenges that Ukrainians are suffering there. Let's pick out a few bits from his paper he's just written. So what does this have to say? So Ukraine's strategy of attrition. This is about attrition, about how Ukraine have done the war and Russia to some degree. So attrition has been both sides' primary approach at the tactical level of the war. So that's doing the war on each individual battles rather than the whole operational or strategic front. So maneuver warfare yielded operational results because extensive attrition made it possible. In other words, when you're talking about, say, the Kharkiv offensive, that whole operation there was made possible because in lots of places there was tactical attrition of troops. This is not unexpected, as most major conventional wars feature attrition, maneuver, and reconstitution. Advanced Western weapons such as the US supplied high mobility artillery rocket system HIMARS augmented the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assistance ISR. They have not allowed Ukraine to escape the grind of sustained attritional combat, though. HIMARS did provide Ukrainian forces with the capability they did not have, long-range precision strike, enabled by sustained US intelligence support. Its main effect was to diminish Russia's artillery advantage, which indirectly enabled Ukrainian offensive operations. Broadly in line with the theory of maneuver warfare, the Ukrainian armed forces did seek to degrade the Russian forces' physical, mental, and moral cohesion by targeting critical support systems such as command and control nodes and supply depots. In practice, as though this was primarily accomplished by attrition and mass fires rather than by maneuver and precision strike. Ukrainian artillery has often operated on its own, and offensive maneuver has yielded mixed results against a prepared defense with a high density of forces. It is a combination of traditional fires and repeated ground assaults that set the stage for offensive Ukrainian operations. Long-range precision strikes on Russian command and control, ammunition and ground lines of communication did not appear to significantly enhance Ukraine's ability to conduct maneuver warfare. Maneuver warfare proved successful when prolonged attrition made it easy. Ukraine has not been able to make military gains on short timelines without major increases in available personnel, materiel, and ammunition. The Ukrainian armed forces' offensives in Kharkiv and Kherson illustrated their limitations as well as their prowess. And he goes on to have a real analysis of the Kharkiv offensive. I won't go too deeply into that, but suffice to say that the main element was attrition, as months of heavy artillery duels, reportedly costing both sides significant casualties, set the conditions for the counteroffensive. Fighting over the summer in the Donbass depleted both Russian and Ukrainian forces and forced the former, so that's the Russians, to redeploy troops and assets out of Kharkiv Oblast to defend elsewhere. So in other words, down the Donbass, it had been really expensive in terms of Russians losing troops. So they took troops from the Kharkiv area that was not seeing major activity and brought them down into the Donbass. Hence, the offensive took advantage of 6 months of attrition, prior localized attacks in Izium, and Russia's structural deficit of manpower across a broad front. So, from this perspective, Ukraine's Kharkiv operations did not illustrate the effectiveness of precision-guided munitions so much as they highlighted the consequences of a low force-to-space ratio on the Russian side, combined with steady attrition that enabled Ukrainian forces to maneuver. Okay, translated, what does that mean? So, how Ukraine were able to do that lightning advance in Kharkiv. Let's try and get the old map up just so you know what I'm talking about here. So the lightning offensive took place in this area. So if you remember, I don't know if you remember, Kharkiv was not quite surrounded, but the Russians were all over here basically, and then they suddenly lost an awful lot of ground because the Ukrainians punched through and there was no kind of rear defenses, no second, third echelon lines of defenses. So the Ukrainians were able to push behind. The Russians panicked, they routed, and they left behind a load of troops and equipment, and it was all pretty terrible. Now, when Kaufman and his co-author talk about a low force to space ratio, it means that basically the troops are spread out. There wasn't a high density of troops there, partially because they're drawn a lot of those troops away from Kharkiv to try to support difficult fights going on elsewhere. And so this left it weak here, and the Ukrainians took advantage. So it wasn't so much that HIMARS were taking key command and control centers and ammunition depots and whatever that left them weak. It was basically attrition elsewhere, forcing a low force to space ratio. Obviously, things like precision strikes help, but it's not the be all and end all. So while Russian forces could observe the build-up of Ukrainian forces in Kharkiv in July and August, Russia still elected, and so this bad decision might also be somewhat culpable, to relocate some of its best ground forces of existing formations deployed to Ukraine as part of the eastern group of forces to southern Ukraine. Other units were engaged in fighting at Bakhmut. So and much of the central group of forces were unable to provide reinforcement. Okay, translated, what that means is, I don't know if you remember back then, but Ukraine, and I presume this was purposefully done, we're talking about, we are going to do a counteroffensive in Kherson. We're going to do a counteroffensive in Kherson. By the way, we're going to do a counteroffensive in Kherson. And they talked about this week after week after week, and the Russians piled in loads of troops into Kherson and right across the river, and then the Ukrainians hammered the logistics across the river and trapped all those troops there. Those troops had to come from somewhere, and they were drawn somewhat from Kharkiv, and if they weren't directly from there, they were somewhere else, and then troops from Kharkiv were then sent to reinforce the areas that those troops were drawn from, which meant that that decision fed into the fact that there was a low preponderance of Russian troops in that whole region. So other units were engaged in fighting at Bakhmut. Oh yeah, I said that. So this left Kharkiv a thinly covered area with badly depleted, incohesive units that could not effectively mount a defense. And that kind of Thunder Road attack, they were able to get in behind and do all the things that I said earlier and take a vast amount of territory in a very short amount of time. And the Russians could not do much about it. The Kherson offensive was completely different. But likewise, attrition set the stage for Ukraine's successful Kherson offensive. But Kherson, unlike Kharkiv, proved a slog. Ukrainian forces enjoyed a favorable position as the Russian front was separated from its logistical support by the Dnipro River. Ukrainian artillery and most importantly HIMARS systems have been striking Russian logistical hubs, bridges and critical infrastructure for 2 months in advance of the Ukrainian offensive. Its initial thrust, which started in late August, quickly stalled with significant casualties taken. But fighting at a disadvantage, the Russian commander sought to withdraw to pursue a defensive strategy and preserve the force, and was allowed to do so given that an attritional battle favoured Ukraine and a forced Russian retreat appeared inevitable. Over several weeks, the Russians withdrew in an organised manner, taking their serviceable equipment with them. Western analysts had expected heavy Russian casualties from long-range precision strikes, but those strikes were unable to impede the withdrawal of 30 to 40,000 Russian troops from Kherson, and Ukraine could not force a collapse of the Russian lines. Russian forces left relatively unscathed. So that was probably one of Russia's most successful moments, a withdrawal. It had been tough. So when the Ukrainians had tried to do offensives around there, they actually lost quite a lot of troops and equipment as the Russians were dug in. And this kind of makes you wonder what's going to happen when the Russians are all equally dug in around here. Now the Ukrainians arguably have better equipment than they did back in the time that they were trying to take Kherson, but it was difficult. The Ukrainians did not do a particularly good job of taking out vast numbers or even relatively large numbers of Russian troops and equipment in Kherson, certainly compared to Kharkiv. Right, and as we sort of meandered towards a conclusion on this, the effects of attrition have been pronounced on both sides, as neither Ukraine nor Russia's military appears capable of executing large-scale combined arms maneuvers. Remember, combined arms is artillery, infantry, mechanized equipment, tanks, IFVs, APCs, air support, logistics, everything, right? That would mitigate them. A key question is therefore how quickly the Ukrainian armed forces can regenerate their offensive potential to conduct a sustained ground offensive against Russian forces in Ukraine. One indication of the difficulty of regaining combat effectiveness in existing maneuver brigades is the fact that in the past several months, a primary tactical unit on both sides has been not the battalion or the brigade, but rather the company. So that's a much smaller unit of troops and equipment. One Western analyst, using information from a Russian source, reported that the Ukrainian company tactical group as of June 2022, consisted of 20 to 25 tracked infantry fighting vehicles, 10 to 12 tanks, 6 to 12 self-propelled guns, and up to 6 multiple launch rocket systems, and 250 to 450 personnel. Based on estimated casualty rates and equipment losses, current Ukrainian company tactical groups are likely much smaller than that. The United States and its NATO allies are making focused effort to address the challenge and related ones. The US is providing Ukraine with qualitative advantage in precision fires, so better equipment, and with others in equipping it with armored fighting vehicles, including tanks in quantity. So it's qualitative and quantitative advantages, and hopefully with the quantity of quality stuff. Furthermore, the US Army has established in Germany a combined arms training program geared to battalion-sized units, and it goes on to talk about that in much more detail. But that's the kind of stuff they need to do: is reconstitute, retrain, really get a competitive advantage over the Russians in terms of training and equipment, to then be able to do your proper maneuver warfare, but bearing in mind that it will be attritional because the Russians are dug in much more like Kherson than like Kharkiv. You're not going to get a Kharkiv again. Ukraine still faces a daunting task. It no longer enjoys a personnel advantage and faces an entrenched Russian military with a much higher density of forces relative to terrain. So that's my point. The introduction of additional land-based precision fire capabilities, such as the American ground-launched small diameter bomb (GLSDB), into Ukraine's arsenal is unlikely to fundamentally alter the military balance between Ukrainian and Russian forces, because the latter have been effectively adjusting to precision strikes. So Russia have actually been adapting. It's easy to criticize the Russians, but they have shown adaptation on the battlefield. These considerations suggest that future Ukrainian gains are likely to be more incremental and to come at a higher cost unless the Russian military significantly misspends combat power in its own offensive operations. Ukraine's preferred way of war centers on the use of artillery fire to facilitate decisive attritional effects on the opposing force, which it then exploits with maneuver. Accordingly, the war has produced high expenditures of ammunition and rates of casualties on both sides. Land warfare still favors the defender, and between adversaries of comparable strength, breaking out of attrition and overcoming the defensive advantage is still far from easy. So that means that when the Ukrainians are going to be doing their counteroffensive, the battlefield, the operational situation still favors the defenders. So the Russians are favored there, and it becomes attritional, and there will be a really high chance, unless the Russians suddenly collapse, there's a high chance that it will be expensive in terms of lives lost and equipment lost. Future military operations in Ukraine will likely have more in common with the attrition phase in the run-up to the Russian withdrawal from Kherson city and Oblast west of the Dnipro than with the Kharkiv offensive. Exactly what I was saying. In this light, it concludes, it is sensible for the Pentagon and allied defense ministries to try to scale up combined arms training and provide additional types and greater numbers of precision-guided weapons. Now, this is happening, and we have seen this training. We're also seeing something new, which is these brigades of drone operators I've already talked about. And that could really assist the Ukrainians in their counteroffensive efforts. Higher combined arms of proficiency could offer Ukraine a qualitative advantage on the battlefield by enabling its forces to more effectively coordinate the joint use of weapons systems such as armored infantry fighting vehicles, main battle tanks, self-propelled artillery, and air defense systems, among other assets. Even with more effective wide-scale combined arms training and precision tanks, however, it is unlikely that the Ukrainian armed forces will be able to escape attrition. In other words, it's going to cost. Hopefully that was of some use to you in going through that. Goodness me. Right. So I've spoken for a long time. That's probably enough for me today. I'll leave the rest for another time, but I really appreciate you listening to this. I recorded this yesterday, so this is going to go out on Sunday morning my time, because I'll be doing some family stuff, and then I'll get back to do my news and Frontline updates in a kind of weird order. I hope that's okay. Please like, subscribe, and share, and thank you so much for being part of this.